Now here's an old idea. This is one of the most profound ideas I've ever encountered. It burned itself into my imagination when I first encountered it. I think I read it in Carl Jung, but it's not his idea. It's an old Jewish idea, and it's an idea that emerged as a consequence of meditating on the nature of God. And this has nothing to do, in some sense, with whether or not you believe in God. Just put that aside for a moment. It's not the point. There's a different point that this Zen-like koan mystery presents. So one of the great questions, unsolved questions, is why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there being itself? Why does anything exist? Perhaps non-existence would be better. Well, we're tempted by that. For example, if we become suicidal, we're tempted by that thought. Things are so terrible that perhaps it would be better if they didn't exist at all. It's a very dark road that idea takes you down, by the way, the darkest of roads, but it's a comprehensible temptation under certain circumstances. So here's the idea. Take a being with the classical attributes of God: omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence. You can do anything, be anything. You can be anywhere. You're everywhere at once. You can be anything you want. You have unlimited power. What do you lack? Limitation. Right. So why is there something rather than nothing? Because limitation has advantages over totality. There's advantages to it. Well, what's the consequence of limitation? Suffering. That's one consequence. No being without suffering. Maybe that's the rule. There cannot be being without suffering. You might say, well, then there shouldn't be being at all, because the suffering is too much. Fair enough. It's a powerful argument. But maybe there's an alternative. Maybe there's a mode of being that justifies the suffering so that you can have the being, so that you can have your cake and eat it too. And I would say that the great religious tradition that underlies our civilization is an attempt to determine what pathway in life allows for being and its fragility to exist at the same time that it can be transcended. And it's something like this. It's something like to accept the strictures of the limitation, to embrace it. I saw this. I'll give you an image that's associated with this. I was in Australia in February, I believe, and I went to this Orthodox Christian cathedral. The Orthodox Christians like me for some reason, and so they keep inviting me places. And so I went to this cathedral, and there was a painting, a medieval painting, because the Orthodox types really like medieval iconography, and so it was a medieval painting, triptych, 3 paintings in a sequence. And the middle one had a picture of Christ. Looked like it was painted like in the 13th century, but it wasn't. It was modern. And there was a cross in front of him, and he was stepping up to it on a set of steps and inviting people to come along. And so I looked at that and I thought, oh, I know what that image means. Some of it. You never assume that you know what an image like that means in its totality, but it means something that you can understand, or someone wouldn't have made it and there'd be no communicative intent. It has meaning. You wouldn't build a whole damn church around it if there was nothing to it. It's a lot of effort to put into guarding an image like that no one can fully comprehend. But what it meant in part was the gateway to proper life is through acceptance of the vulnerability of being. It's an invitation, right? Well, you're limited and you're going to suffer. So what are you going to do about that? You're going to avoid it? You're going to turn away from it? Or you're going to turn around and embrace it? And what if it was the case that to the degree that you embraced it, you would simultaneously transcend it? It could easily be the case. It looks like it's the case if you look at it purely from the clinical perspective, because it turns out that if you get people to turn around and face the things that terrify them into a corner, then they develop. They get to be more than they are. We don't know the limits of that proposition. You know, if you were willing to accept everything that was terrifying about your situation as the necessary price for being, if you could drop all the resentment that was associated with that and justify it as it is. I'm not trying to make a case that this is a straightforward thing to do because the suffering is real. Well, then maybe that's the best pathway forward to transcending it, and maybe even to some degree rectifying it, because one of the things that's so interesting is that not only do people who turn around and confront difficult problems gain psychologically, but they often solve the problems. And God only knows how many problems we could solve if we were all in, all of us, instead of running at 51% committed to the good and 49% scattered everywhere in the wind. You know, it's amazing what people can accomplish when they're single-mindedly pursuing something. They're really, really unstoppable. And so if there were many, many people who were unstoppable in that manner, who knows what we could create out of the possibility that's in front of us. And so, well, so that's part of the meditation on Rule 12. It's like, and you think about it, you actually like limitation. Well, one of the things we know, for example, I've done a fair bit of work, published work on creativity, and I know the literature on creativity quite well, and creativity is a gift, by the way. Not everyone is creative, far from it, and it's just as well, because most creative people fail dismally at everything they do. So it's not something to be fervently wished for. Most creative ideas are catastrophic failures, and they take the person who has the idea out with them. Now, they're necessary because now and then you have a creative idea that's so damn good it just wins everything. But it's a high-risk, high-stakes bet, and most of the time you fail. And so it's okay that everyone isn't creative because it's a very risky enterprise. If you want a creative solution to a problem, it actually turns out that putting more constraints on your pursuit produces more creativity than putting less constraints on it. I'll give you a funny example. You could look this up if you wanted to, if you don't have anything better to do. You know what a haiku is, a Japanese poem? It's ridiculous, eh? It's like, you can only have 3 lines. So why 3? Couldn't you say more than 50? It's like, yeah, but it's 3. It's 3. You're going to play the haiku game, and then each sentence has a certain number of syllables. And if you don't follow the rules, then you don't get to write a haiku. That's it. You've got to accept the limitations. So there's this funny archive online, which I think is just exactly what human beings are like. So there's this archive online called the Spam Haiku Archive. And it's not the kind of spam that you get in your email. It's like the lunch meat, you know, the pink lunch meat. And there are 15,000, the last time I looked, 15,000 haikus about spam in this archive. And that's what people are like. It's like, okay, well, you know, it's not bad enough to write a haiku. Anyone can do that. It's like, no, we're going to make it about the least poetic object we can possibly conceive of. And they're unbelievably witty and comical. And, you know, there's a game in that. It's right. And the game is, well, let's limit ourselves to some extreme and ridiculous manner and find in that limitation a wealth of possibilities that wouldn't otherwise exist. And it's so perverse, you know, you think, well, why are people vulnerable? And I don't know if this is a justification for the vulnerability of being. Perhaps it is. Maybe it's a justification for being. It's so strange that perversely, when you impose limitations on yourself that are stringent, you open up a world of possibilities that wouldn't otherwise exist. It's like, well, think about chess, for example. There's a lot of chess games, like possible chess games. There's many, many of them. And, you know, you might think, well, isn't it just kind of arbitrary that you can only move a knight in an L shape? Like, wouldn't it be better if just all the pieces were queens? It's like, no. It wouldn't be better, because you couldn't play chess then. And that's so strange. It's like, this is what you're saying. You're saying, you take the pieces of the chess game and you make them less limited, which is what you do if you transform them all into queens, and then the game is destroyed. So what's up with that? How can more be less? And I don't know the answer to that exactly. Like, I don't understand it precisely, but it's clearly, and, you know, when you're playing a video game, you incarnate yourself in another world. And it has slightly different rules. And you think, well, that's entertaining. Let's jump into a world that has different constraints and see what possibilities emerge as a consequence. And you do that voluntarily. It's like, and you know, I actually think there's something deeply metaphysical and profound about that, because the closest simulations we have to reality are video games. And you know, we think of video games as just games, but they're simulations. And the simulations, it's a huge industry, and you know, and the demand for reality in simulation is one of the things that drives computational power forward. There aren't many things that we need the vast computational power that we continue to develop to do, but one of the things we need that computational power to do is to make ever more real simulations in game space. And so then we make these universes that emerge online, and we pop ourselves into avatars, and we take on limitations that we wouldn't otherwise have, and experience worlds of possibility that we wouldn't otherwise have. And since we're trying to simulate reality when we're making those games, how do we know that that's not an accurate simulation of reality? Maybe it is. There's something necessary about limitation. So then you embrace limitation. You say yes to it to the degree that you can, and that requires courage. It's the same as the picture that I just described to you. It means that you have to willingly accept your mortal limitations with all the horror that entails. And there isn't anything you can do that's more courageous than that. It's like embracing your own death. Death as a precondition for being. And that could easily be the case. And I don't know if people could even manage that, because it's a lot to ask. But it does appear that is the pathway forward. It really does appear that way. And it might turn out, too, that you discover that there's a lot more to you than you thought, because maybe you're strong enough to actually do that. And if you found out that you were strong enough to do that, well, then maybe a lot of the sting in it would disappear. It's possible. You know already that if you do something, Nietzsche said, he who has a why can bear any how. And so, you have to stumble forward in life with the burdens that you've been cursed or blessed with, I suppose. And the best way to stumble forward under those conditions is to do something that's tremendously worthwhile. Think, yes, that was worth it. Because that's what you want to think when you're doing something, or when you're finished it. While you're doing it, you want to think, this is worthwhile. And what do you mean? It means it justifies the sacrifices that I'm making. There's something about the process that I'm engaged in that justifies the sacrifices that I'm making. Well, that's what you need for your whole life. You need something for your whole life that justifies the sacrifice of your life. And maybe that's within your grasp. And I do believe that that's to be found through the adoption of responsibility. And the responsibility for you, responsibility for your family, responsibility for your community. But at a more fundamental level, it's responsibility to put yourself together so that when you encounter the potential that lies in front of you, you make the decisions that transform that potential into the best possible reality. And I think we're all doing that. That's what... And I think we hold each other accountable for that. We hold ourselves accountable for that, and we hold the people around us accountable for that. Because, you tell yourself, if you're looking back at your life with regret, you think, there was so much potential there that I didn't use, and now it's gone. And that fills you with sorrow. And if you have children and you think, well, my children aren't living up to their potential, then you're not happy with them, You want to shake your fist at them or your finger at them and say, look, you want to shake them, and you want to say, look, I know there's more to you. I want you to live up to your potential. Well, and it outrages you ethically, unless you're jealous of your children, which is a very bad idea. It outrages you ethically that they're not doing everything they could. You can see the wonderful person that's there. You have privileged access to that as their parent. You could see what they could be, and then it hurts your soul when they deviate from what you believe you've seen that they could manifest. And so this is deeply embedded in us in an ethical sense, and it's part of our dialogue with our conscience. We hold ourselves accountable when we don't live up to our potential, when we don't interact with what's in front of us and bring what's best forward. So, I did these biblical lectures last year. Yeah, thank you. I'm hoping I'll get back to them in September. That's the plan. I want to start lecturing about Exodus, which is a story I absolutely love. It's an absolutely amazing story. It's unbelievably deep, and like the stories in Genesis. And I was very interested, especially in the opening of Genesis, because I believe that our political system is nested inside a story. It has to be, just like your waking consciousness is nested inside a dream. You have to dream. You cannot live without dreaming. You'll lose your mind if you don't dream. You have to dream, and no one really knows why. The psychoanalysts made a lot of progress in determining why, I think, especially Carl Jung. But But in any case, it's the case that your linear, articulated, waking consciousness is dependent for its integrity on the dream. And we don't know what the dream is. It's images and it's stories and it's artistic endeavor and it's the great narrative of humanity. It's the stories that structure what we don't yet understand. It's like there's a buffer between what we know and can say and what we don't know at all, and that buffer is filled by the dream. And for better or worse, the dream that our culture's embedded in is a religious dream. And the religious dream is old. It's very old, and it's something that's evolved. It's not something that people thought up in any real sense any more than you think up what you dream. Dreams happen to you, and the religious revelations that underlie our culture happen to us. And we did what we could to make them coherent and to lay them out. It doesn't mean we understand them, but it doesn't matter because they're the buffer ground between what we understand completely and what we don't understand at all. It's the great dream of mankind, the religious substructure. And I was very interested in the stories at the beginning of Genesis because they're very, very old. Who knows how old they are? God only knows how old they are. They're very, very old. And obviously they're unforgettable because we didn't forget them. And so there's it's something to think about. Stories don't survive for thousands and thousands of years by accident. At the very least, they're adapted to our memory, right? Obviously, the stories that survive are those that are adapted to our memory. So they fit us like a key fits a lock. And it doesn't mean we can understand them. And so I tried to understand the first part of Genesis for a very long period of time, and there's a series of propositions in the book that I think are extremely interesting, and so let me lay them out. So the first are the characters, or the elements of reality. That's a more accurate way of putting it. What are the fundamental building blocks of reality? As consciously experienced, that's a better way of thinking about it. This isn't a materialistic idea. It's a different kind of idea. It's the fundamental elements of experience, not the fundamental elements of material reality. It's a different idea. Genesis presents this notion, and it's echoed in mythology all around the world. The same sort of substructure. I wrote a lot about this in Maps of Meaning, finding out about these things from people like Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell and Eric Neumann and these great mythological scholars of the 20th century. So in Genesis, you have three elements of experience. You have whatever God is, you have whatever God's word is, and you have whatever that operates on. And whatever it operates on is the tohu vabohu. It's potential, it's chaotic potential. It's something like that which could be, but isn't. And I think that's the same potential you confront when you wake up in the morning. You think about the future. So what's the future? Well, you can't hold it, you can't touch it. It has no weight or no mass. It has no presence. It isn't real. It's only potential. But potential is it's the reality that isn't yet. And there isn't any way of gripping it any tighter than that because it isn't but could be. And that's what it is. It's what isn't but could be. And that's what you confront always. That's what you're grappling with. And that's portrayed on the large scale in the initial parts of Genesis. You have God. God's a paternal structure. It's the same thing as the structure that you are, except on the large scale. And then that uses a process, and that's the word, to encounter the chaos and transform it into reality. And so, and what does that mean? I mean, remember, this is the fundamental story of our culture. It means that your ability to use your communicative, your conscious and communicative intent truthfully is what can be used to take the potential that lies in front of you and cast it into being. So the word is communicative intent, but it's also the truth. It's both of those in the opening chapters of Genesis. It's communicative intent and truth. And so you use communicative intent and truth to encounter potential and turn it into reality. And so that's what God does. And then every time he does that, day after day in the narrative, then he steps back and says that it's good. And so here's the hypothesis. Well, that's the first thing. He says that it's good. And then the next thing that happens is that another proposition is laid forth, and that proposition is that man and woman alike are made in the image of God. So the first part of the story is a description of what constitutes God. God is a structure that uses truthful communicative intent to extract habitable order out of chaos. And then to the degree that, so if what's being used to encounter potential is truthful, then the reality that arises is good. It's an ethical proposition. And it's really interesting. I think it's the deepest of ethical propositions. So here's what it means. It means something like, there isn't any better way to transform what could be into what is than to do it with truth. Period. And it's a very weird thing to contemplate because, well, we clap and we're happy about this, but we're not. Because lots of times telling the truth gets you in real trouble, right? It's easier to circumvent the truth. And at least you think, well, I'll deal with it later. It's like, no, you won't, because it'll be way out of hand later. If you don't deal with it right now, you take the easy way out because you don't want the conflict in the present. I'm not saying that you should run around getting yourself in trouble, but people aren't that careful with what they say. And they're not that careful with how they act. And it's partly because they think they can get away with it, or because they don't want to withstand the conflict that utilizing the truth in the moment would produce. And I don't mean you get to tell the truth just to hurt people's feelings. Like that's not the truth. It's partial truth used as a perverse weapon. The truth is much more complex than that. But the proposition in the story of Genesis is that if you confront potential with the truth, then the reality that you produce as a consequence is good. And that's a hell of a thing to think about. And I do believe that it's the case. I mean, I do believe that we tell people that we love that they should exist in the truth. You don't tell your children that they should lie about everything and their life will go very well. Unless you're a bloody psychopath, and you're oriented very, very much towards producing something approximating hell. And even if you don't live out the truth yourself, if you're attempting to advise someone that you care about, then you try to put them on the straight and narrow path. And so we all know at the base of our being that the proper way of interacting with potential is with truth. And the proposition in the first chapter of Genesis is that the reality that's produced as a consequence of facing potential with truth is good. And that could be, and so that's a guideline to how to live in limitation. You have limitation, and that puts potential in front of you. But the price that you pay for that is suffering and the possibility of malevolence. And the question is, well, how do you maintain the possibility without falling prey to the suffering or degenerating through the malevolence? And the answer is, you confront the potential with truth. And I think I think it's true. I think it's right. I think it's accurate. And I think also that, I also think that we know this, although not consciously enough. And the reason I think we know it is because we set up our entire societal structure, particularly in the West. But the ideas are spreading everywhere very rapidly. Particularly in the West, we set up our society in the following manner. What's of sovereign importance in the West? The individual. Period. The end. Even religiously speaking, we have a divine individual at the center of our mythological conception. I'm not speaking religiously. I'm speaking anthropologically or psychologically. You can leave the metaphysics behind. You don't have to, but you can. The idea is that the individual is at the center. And why? Because the individual is the thing that confronts potential and transforms it into reality. And the reality that is manifest is a consequence of the nature of the ethical choice of the individual. And it's on that the ship of state sails forward or founders. The question is, do we believe that? It's like, well, is there another way of conceptualizing how we've structured our society? I can't see it. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Well, what's the equality exactly? I mean, it's not like we're all the same, because we're not. There must be something fundamental that's associated with being human that's the foundation for that equality, that value that puts you not above the law, but at least beside the law, that keeps the state at bay from you. Well, what else can it be than your willingness to contend with potential itself and to determine the course of the unfolding of reality, to decide whether you're going to tilt things towards heaven or towards hell, because you've got both choices. And it's necessary to understand that. It's terrifying to understand that, because it means that everything you do that you don't do properly tilts and shifts things in a direction that if you had any sense you would not want to go. And that's it's a horrifying realization, and it's no wonder people shy away from it. But the cost of shying away from that is to casually engage in that sort of behavior. And I think, and I learned this from Jung as well, is we're too technologically powerful for that now. We don't have a buffer. We have to get our act together. And because we're at this cusp of power in some sense, where we can change everything. And if we're sensible enough, maybe we'll change everything so it'll be radically better. And if we're not sensible, then maybe we'll change everything so it will be radically worse. And we got a taste of that already in the 20th century. It would be lovely not to revisit that. And so I wrote 12 Rules for Life and Maps of Meaning, because I discovered some of these things and they struck me very deeply. They changed the way that I looked at the world. They terrified me into being very careful with what I said. And that's being extremely useful. And so it's been a great privilege, by the way, to be able to go on this tour and to talk to everybody about this and to talk to all of you tonight about it. And so I studied the most horrifying things that I could find for a very long period of time. And the consequence of that was that it made me optimistic. There's an old alchemical dictum that I learned from reading Carl Jung, Inster qualinus invenitur. It means that which you most want to find will be found where you least want to look. And it's the same idea as rescuing your father from the belly of the beast. The deeper and darker the place that you look in, the brighter the light that shines at the bottom. And the reason for that, as far as I can tell, is because we are capable of transcending the hell that we are also capable of producing. That's within our grasp. And so the lectures, as far as I'm concerned, from my perspective, are an invitation that everyone that I'm communicating with, an invitation to everyone that I'm communicating with, to aim up instead of down, and to understand that that is your role in the world. You're making the choice with every decision you make between moving things towards heaven or moving them towards hell. And that's meaning. It's a meaning that will imbue your life with the significance that's necessary and help to rectify what's wrong with the world. And I think I'll leave it at that for the time being. Thank you very much.